I keep a fountain pen in the top drawer of my desk that my wife Eleanor gave me 31 years ago, the year we signed the papers on our very first warehouse. That pen had signed every contract, every payroll check, every acquisition that turned Brennan Freight from 4 rusted trucks into a $110 million logistics company. That night, my daughter Vanessa slid a stack of legal documents across my own kitchen table and told me to sign with a different pen entirely, a cheap plastic one she'd brought herself, and demanded I do it before midnight or I would lose everything I had ever built. She had absolutely no idea that 3 days earlier, using my own fountain pen, in a lawyer's office she knew nothing about, I had already changed one single name on one single document, and that one name was going to be the reason her entire plan collapsed before she even finished reading it out loud. I did not tell her that. I let her keep talking. I let her believe the clock was still running in her favor. If you have ever had a family member try to talk you out of your own life's work while wearing a smile that never once reached their eyes, tell me in the comments how you handled it. And if you've never had to fight for what you built with your own 2 hands against the people who were supposed to love you the most, stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why an old man learns to keep a second pen, to understand how Vanessa ended up standing in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night with a folder of papers and an ultimatum. You have to go back exactly 6 days, to the morning after we buried my wife. The funeral home had sent flowers to the house that nobody asked for. White lilies stacked in the front hallway like a wall between me and the rest of my life. Eleanor had been gone 11 weeks by then, taken by ovarian cancer that the doctors caught 4 months too late to matter. 42 years of marriage ended in a hospice room with a window that faced a parking lot, and I had held her hand until the machines stopped making their small, quiet sounds. I was 64 years old, and for the first time since I was 22, I woke up in a house with no one else breathing in it. I was standing at the kitchen counter that morning, not really doing anything, just holding an empty coffee mug and staring at the garden Eleanor used to tend every Saturday, when I heard the front door open without a knock. Vanessa let herself in. She had a key, of course. I had given her 1 year ago, back when a key from your father meant something other than access. She walked into my kitchen already dressed for a boardroom, not for a house of mourning. Charcoal suit, hair pulled back tight, a leather folio tucked under one arm like a weapon she'd been sharpening for weeks. She did not hug me. She did not ask how I had slept, whether I had eaten, whether the silence in the house had started to feel like it was pressing on my chest, which it had. She set the folio down on the counter, right next to the mug I was still holding, and opened it to the first page. Dad, we need to talk about the company, she said, in the exact tone she used to give instructions to junior staff. Before things get complicated. I looked down at the paper. Emergency Operating Authority and Interim Trusteeship Agreement. It read across the top in bold letters, the kind of language lawyers use when they want something to sound procedural instead of predatory. Vanessa, I said quietly, your mother's been gone 11 weeks. I know exactly how long it's been, she said, and something in her voice cracked just enough that I almost believed the grief underneath it was real. That's why we can't wait any longer. You haven't been to the office in 2 months. The board is asking questions. Preston and I think it's time we formalize things, just until you're back on your feet. Preston was her husband, a man I had put on the company payroll 14 years ago as a courtesy, and had watched, ever since, contribute almost nothing beyond a pleasant smile and a talent for agreeing with whoever was speaking loudest in the room. He was 41 years old, and had never once, in 14 years, brought me an idea I hadn't already had myself. Formalize what exactly, I said, setting the mug down harder than I meant to. Interim signing authority, just for me and Preston, so the company keeps running smoothly while you grieve. She said the word grieve the way other people say inconvenience. You built something extraordinary, Dad. Nobody's trying to take that away from you. We're trying to protect it. I had spent 38 years building Brennan Freight from a used flatbed truck and $1,100 I'd borrowed against a life insurance policy. Eleanor had kept the books at our kitchen table, back when we couldn't afford an office. back when we ate the same can of soup for 3 nights running, so we could make payroll for our first 2 drivers. Every mile of that company had her fingerprints on it as much as mine, and now, 11 weeks after I buried her, my daughter was standing in that same kitchen asking me to hand the keys to a man who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a bar tab. "I'm not signing anything today," I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I'd learned to keep it level across 3 decades of union negotiations and hostile buyout attempts. Losing your composure in a negotiation is how you lose the negotiation. I need time to think this through. Something flickered across Vanessa's face, gone almost as fast as it appeared, but I caught it. Not disappointment, irritation, the look of someone whose timeline had just been inconvenienced. "Of course," she said smoothly, closing the folio. "Take all the time you need. I just don't want you to be blindsided if the board starts asking why the CEO hasn't shown his face in 2 months." She kissed my cheek on her way out, a gesture as cold and practiced as a stamp on an envelope, and I stood alone in my kitchen listening to her heels click across my driveway toward a car that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. I did not go back to bed. I stood at that window for a long time, watching the empty garden, thinking about the particular kind of loneliness that comes from realizing the people circling you are not there to catch you. The next morning, I drove to the office before sunrise, the way I used to when the company was young, and every hour mattered. Brennan Freight's headquarters sat on the edge of the industrial district outside Columbus, a modest 4-story building I'd built myself back, when modest was all we could afford, and had never bothered to replace with something flashier, because Eleanor always said a company should look like the work it does, not like the money it spends pretending. I badged into the parking garage with the master key card that had never once failed me in 11 years. It failed me at the executive elevator. I swiped it twice, 3 times, watched the little red light blink at me with mechanical indifference. I stood there in the empty lobby at 6 in the morning, staring at a door that had opened for me every single day since we installed it, feeling something cold settle low in my stomach. "Trouble with your card, Walter?" I turned around. Marcus Reyes was standing near the security desk, entirely too polished for 6 in the morning, his suit pressed, his cologne loud enough to fill the whole lobby. Marcus was our chief financial officer, 48 years old, hired 11 years earlier on the strength of a resume that promised discipline and delivered. I would later learn something considerably darker. "Card's not reading," I said. "Ah, right. I should have called you," Marcus said, sliding his hands into his pockets with the easy confidence of a man who had rehearsed his lie in the mirror that morning. "We're running a full security migration this week. Preston authorized it Tuesday, said with you taking leave to grieve, it made sense to modernize the access protocols while things were quieter. Executive floors locked out of the old cards until the new system's live. Nothing personal, just bad timing. Preston authorized it. Preston, who had never authorized so much as a new coffee machine without asking me first, had apparently found the confidence to lock the founder of the company out of his own executive floor. I did not argue. I did not demand the technicians reverse it on the spot, though every part of me wanted to. I had learned, across 4 decades of business, that the moment you show your hand in anger, you hand your opponent exactly the leverage they were hoping for. If I made a scene in that lobby, by lunchtime there would be a story circulating about the grieving founder who'd had some kind of episode at the office. That story would be worth more to Vanessa than anything written on paper. "Modernizing is overdue," I said instead, forcing something that almost passed for a smile. "Tell Preston I appreciate the initiative." I turned and walked back to my truck without looking back, though I could feel Marcus watching me the entire way. And something about the particular quality of that stare told me this was not the first secret being kept from me inside that building. I drove home, but I did not go inside. I sat in the driveway for a long time with the engine off, running through everything I knew and everything I was beginning to suspect. A locked elevator, a folder of transfer documents produced 11 weeks after my wife's funeral, a son-in-law suddenly discovering the confidence to authorize systems changes. None of it, on its own, meant much. Together, it had the unmistakable shape of a plan already in motion, one that had likely started long before Eleanor's last breath, one they had simply been waiting for the right moment of weakness to execute. I went inside, walked straight to my study, and locked the door behind me for the first time since Eleanor died. There is a drawer in my desk that only I know about. 11 years ago, after a rival freight company tried to buy out 3 of our biggest clients through a coordinated smear campaign, I had a programmer I trusted completely build a private mirror of our entire financial server, something no one on the executive floor knew existed, backed up nightly to a drive I kept hidden beneath a false panel under my bottom drawer. I had never needed it. Until that morning, I had almost forgotten it existed. I pressed my thumb against the small sensor screwed into the underside of the panel, felt the quiet click of the lock releasing, and pulled out a hard drive coated in a fine layer of dust. I connected it to my laptop, typed a password sequence I hadn't used in over a decade, and watched the screen bloom to life with 11 years of financial records I had never stopped legally owning, no matter whose card worked on the executive elevator. I was 30 seconds from opening the payroll ledger when my personal cell phone rang, a number reserved for almost no one, and certainly not for 6:30 in the morning. It was the county hospital. "Mr. Brennan," a woman's voice said, calm in the practiced way of someone who delivers this exact sentence several times. "A shift. This is Memorial General calling about your grandson, Tyler Cole. He's been in a serious car accident. He's currently in surgery and we need a family member here as soon as possible." I do not remember deciding to leave. I remember my hands shaking as I grabbed my keys. Remember the drive to the hospital passing in a blur of red lights I do not recall stopping for. Remember thinking of nothing except the image of a 17-year-old boy I had watched grow up believing, with everything in me, that he carried my blood. The emergency department smelled the way they all smell, antiseptic layered over old coffee and fear. I found Vanessa pacing near the trauma bay doors, phone pressed to her ear, and Preston sitting in a plastic chair with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. For one brief moment, watching my son-in-law fall apart in that ugly fluorescent light, I forgot every suspicion from that morning and simply felt sorry for him. "What happened?" I said, gripping Preston's shoulder. "He hit black ice on the overpass." Preston said, his voice raw. "Lost control, hit the guardrail. He's got internal bleeding, they're operating now," they said. His voice broke apart entirely. A trauma surgeon pushed through the double doors a few minutes later, his scrubs marked with small dark stains, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been standing over an open body for the better part of an hour. He gathered the 3 of us together in a tight, anxious circle in the hallway. "He's stable for now," the surgeon said, holding a clipboard against his chest. "We've controlled the internal bleeding, but he lost a significant amount of blood at the scene and his levels are still dangerously low. He needs a transfusion, and I want to be upfront with you. This is where it gets complicated. Tyler's blood type is AB positive, and we're currently experiencing a shortage in that type due to a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate earlier tonight. If either of you 2 are compatible donors," he said, looking between Vanessa and Preston, "we'd like to bring you back immediately." The hallway seemed to tilt very slightly beneath my feet. I am O positive. Eleanor was O positive. I had watched Preston donate blood at a company drive 9 years earlier, remembered him joking about the free cookies afterward, remembered the little sticker on his shirt that read O negative in bold red letters. Basic genetics, the kind I had learned in a high school biology class more than 40 years ago, does not allow 2 O-type parents, or an O-type father and any mother, to produce an AB positive child through ordinary chance. The B allele has to come from somewhere. It has to come from a father who carries it. I looked at Preston. He was staring at the floor, his face gone the color of old paper, his hands trembling in his lap in a way that had nothing to do with grief for his injured son and everything I understood in that instant to do with terror. He knew. Whatever this meant, Preston already knew. Vanessa did not look at Preston at all. She looked at the surgeon, her jaw tight, and said, "Then get blood from somewhere else. Charter a helicopter if you have to. I'll cover whatever it costs." She pulled a platinum card from her purse before she had even finished the sentence, and I understood, watching her, that she was not trying to solve a medical problem. She was trying to make the conversation stop before anyone asked the question I was already asking myself. The surgeon, unmoved by the card or the tone, said he'd contact a regional blood bank and left us standing in that corridor with a silence heavier than anything that had passed between us in 11 weeks. I did not raise the blood type in front of him. I did not raise it in front of Vanessa. Confronting a wounded animal in an open room, in front of witnesses, is how you lose whatever advantage the truth still holds. I had learned that lesson across 4 decades of contract disputes, long before I ever needed to apply it to my own family. Instead, I suggested to Preston that we get coffee from the cafeteria while we waited on the transfusion. He hesitated, glanced at Vanessa the way a dog glances at its owner before crossing a room, and she waved him off without looking up from her phone, already dialing someone in a low, urgent voice. The cafeteria at that hour was nearly empty, lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes and smelling of burnt coffee. We sat across from each other at a sticky plastic table, and I watched my son-in-law wrap both hands around a paper cup like it was the only solid thing left in the room. "That's quite a coincidence," I said, keeping my voice mild, almost conversational. "Tyler being AB positive, you're O negative. I remember the blood drive 9 years ago." Preston's hand jerked, coffee sloshing over the rim of the cup and onto his fingers. He didn't wipe it off. "Lab mix-ups happen all the time," he said. "Too fast, too loud for a cafeteria at 7 in the morning. You're exhausted, Walter. You're grieving. You're not thinking straight." "I'm thinking very straight," I said. "I've been thinking straight my whole life. It's mostly what I'm good at." I let the silence stretch, watching him fold in on himself a little more with every second that passed without me filling it. "I'm not angry, Preston. I'm asking you a simple question as a man who's known you 14 years. Is there something you've needed to tell me?" He did not answer. He stared into his coffee like it might offer him an escape route, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, but he said nothing at all. That silence told me more than a confession would have. A man who believes in his own innocence gets defensive, gets loud, demands you apologize for the accusation. A man who is guilty goes quiet and waits to see how much you already know. Preston went quiet. I did not push further. I told him to get some rest, that I'd check on Tyler, and I walked away leaving my own coffee untouched on the table, my mind already working through the shape of a much larger and much older lie than a single night of infidelity could explain. Tyler stabilized by mid-morning. The regional blood bank came through. The surgeon declared him out of immediate danger, and by early afternoon Vanessa had switched from panic to logistics, already discussing which private recovery nurse to hire, and whether the hospital would release him by the weekend. I hugged her goodbye, played the part of the relieved grandfather with a competence that surprised even me, and drove home with a plan already assembling itself in my head, piece by cold, deliberate piece. That evening I bought 2 containers of soup, transferred them into glass dishes so they'd look homemade, and drove to Vanessa and Preston's house under the pretense of checking on my grandson. I brought a pair of latex gloves and 2 sterile evidence bags in my coat pocket, purchased that afternoon from a medical supply store on the other side of town where nobody would recognize my face. Preston answered the door, looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days, which by then he likely hadn't. I told him I couldn't rest either, that I wanted to bring dinner and check on Tyler myself. He let me in without hesitation, too tired to think through what an old man carrying soup containers might actually be doing in his house. While Preston reheated the soup, I excused myself to check on Tyler, who was resting upstairs, headphones over his ears, his leg elevated on a stack of pillows. I did not wake him. Instead, I slipped into his adjoining bathroom and, with gloved hands, lifted his electric toothbrush from its holder and sealed it into the first bag. It was the cleanest, most uncontaminated source of genetic material I could think to take without arousing suspicion. Then I found my way to the laundry room off the garage, where Preston, a man of rigid and predictable habits, always tossed his gym clothes into a wicker hamper rather than carrying them the extra 10 feet to the washing machine. I lifted his gray athletic jacket to the dim light, filtering through the garage window, and found, caught along the inner collar, two dark hairs with intact follicles. I plucked them carefully with a set of tweezers I'd brought for exactly this purpose and sealed them into the second bag. I stayed another 20 minutes, ate a bowl of soup I did not taste, told them both how proud Eleanor would have been of how they were handling this crisis, and left with the destruction of their entire fabricated family quietly folded into my coat pocket. I did not drive home. I drove 2 hours to a private genetics laboratory in Dayton that offered expedited testing for a price steep enough to guarantee discretion, paid $4,000 in cash for a rush analysis, and was told the results would be ready within 48 hours. I walked out of that clinic into a parking lot lit only by security floodlights, feeling the particular exhaustion of a man who has just set something irreversible into motion. My phone buzzed before I'd even started the engine. Not a call. An automated alert, one I had not seen in 11 years, triggered by the hidden mirror server I'd built into the company's financial architecture. After that old rival tried to poach our clients, someone was attempting to authorize a wire transfer using a digital signature that mimicked mine, routing 4 separate transactions totaling nearly $600,000 to an account I did not recognize. I drove straight home instead of back to the office. Confronting Marcus Reyes at the source would only warn him to scrub whatever he was hiding before I could see the whole picture. Instead, I locked myself in my study, connected to the mirror server, and watched, in real time, the digital footprints of a man who believed himself far more careful than he actually was. Marcus was good with numbers. He was not good with the deeper architecture beneath the numbers, the layer where I had, over a decade earlier, quietly built myself a permanent window into everything the company's servers ever touched. I traced the wire transfer back through a chain of shell entities registered in Delaware under names so bland they were clearly designed to slide past a board auditor's eye. Continental Freight Advisory, Summit Logistics Consulting, Harborline Solutions Group. Each one existed only on paper, and each one had, over the past 11 months, received regular payments from Brennan Freight disguised as consulting fees for services that, as far as I could tell, scrolling through months of invoices, had never actually been performed. I cross-referenced the dates against our internal accounts and felt something cold crawl up the back of my neck. The very first fraudulent transfer had gone out 11 months earlier. The same week, Eleanor received her diagnosis, while I sat in oncology waiting rooms, holding my wife's hand through the worst news of both our lives. Marcus Reyes had been quietly siphoning money out of the company I'd spent 4 decades building, using my grief as cover, betting correctly that a man watching his wife die would not be reading quarterly consulting invoices with a critical eye. I traced the total. $600,000 had gone through the shell companies over 11 months. But when I pulled the pension administration records, the true number nearly stopped my heart. Nearly $3.8 million had been drained from Brennan Freight's employee retirement fund over the same period, routed through the same shell network, disguised across dozens of smaller transactions, specifically calculated to stay beneath the threshold that would trigger an automatic board review. Truck drivers who had spent 30 years on our routes, warehouse managers who had raised families on our paychecks, their retirements, gone, funneled quietly into accounts controlled by people who called themselves my family. I sat back in my study chair, the glow of the monitor the only light in the room, and let myself feel, for exactly 1 minute, the full weight of the grief. Then I folded it away, the same way I'd folded away every piece of pain across 4 decades of hard negotiations, because grief does not close a case, and it does not protect 300 employees' retirements. Only precision does that. I pulled the transfer agreement Vanessa had left on my counter days earlier and flipped past the surface language to the clauses buried at the very end, the ones written in the smallest font on the page. There it was, exactly as I now expected, a comprehensive indemnification clause absolving any current officer of prior financial liability and language authorizing me as outgoing signatory to certify the accuracy of the company's books for the fiscal year now closing. The document was never about protecting a grieving old man. It was a legal shield, engineered to transfer my signature onto a fraud I had never committed, timed perfectly to close before the annual audit, scheduled in 3 weeks, could find the hole in the pension fund and start asking who, exactly, had signed off on it. They needed my name on that page. They needed it badly enough to hand me an ultimatum 11 weeks after burying my wife. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my desk compiling everything, cross-referencing every shell account, every falsified invoice, every date that lined up with a moment of my life I had been too devastated to watch closely. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, staring at the glow of the monitor, I understood that the fraud and the affair were not two separate betrayals. They were the same betrayal, wearing two different faces. The lab called on the second afternoon. I drove back to Dayton alone, collected a sealed envelope from a receptionist who had no idea what it contained, and sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time before I finally tore it open. The report was dense with genetic markers and probability charts, but I skipped straight to the bolded conclusion at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 0%. The subject, known as Preston Cole, was excluded, absolutely and without margin for error. As the biological father of Tyler Cole, I had known it was coming. I had done the arithmetic in that hospital hallway 2 days earlier, but seeing it printed in clinical, unforgiving language still hit me like a blow to the chest. Tyler was not my grandson, not by blood. Whatever love I had poured into that boy over 17 years, whatever pride I had felt watching him learn to throw a football in my backyard, none of it had a single strand of Brennan blood behind it. The grief lasted exactly as long as it took me to fold the report and place it in my jacket pocket. Then the only question that mattered rose up clean and sharp in my mind. If Preston was not the father, who was? Vanessa was not a careless woman. Whatever else she had become, she was disciplined, calculating, unwilling to gamble her comfortable life on a meaningless affair with a stranger. If she had risked everything, she had risked it with someone useful. Someone who understood exactly how to move money without triggering alarms. Someone with unrestricted access to the deepest financial architecture of the company I had built. I thought of Marcus Reyes standing in that lobby at 6 in the morning, entirely too composed for the hour, entirely too confident, lying to my face about a security migration nobody else had heard of. I picked up my phone and called a man named Sam Delgado, a retired county detective who had spent 22 years working organized fraud cases before going private, a man I had used exactly once before, years earlier, to vet a potential business partner who turned out to have 3 prior bankruptcies he'd conveniently failed to mention. I did not offer him pleasantries. I gave him an address, a name, and a blank check with my signature already on it. I need to know everything about Marcus Reyes, I told him. And I need to know how long he and my daughter have actually known each other. Sam Delgado did not ask why. Men like him rarely do. He simply said he'd have something for me within 72 hours. And I believed him, because the alternative, sitting alone in my grief, while my family finished carving up everything I'd built, was no longer something I was willing to do. I spent the following 3 days performing the role of a broken man with a precision that surprised even me. I answered Vanessa's calls in a slow, exhausted voice. I told her I needed time to process everything, that the accident had shaken me badly, that I simply couldn't think about paperwork yet. I let her believe every single word of it, because a predator who believes she has already won stops watching for the trap closing around her. On the 3rd evening, Sam Delgado called and asked me to meet him at a diner on the edge of the industrial district, the kind of place with sticky vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. He was already seated in the back corner when I arrived, a thick folder resting on the table in front of him, his face carrying the particular stillness of a man who has found exactly what he was hired to find. "You were right to start with Reyes," he said, sliding the folder across the table without preamble. "They weren't as careful as they thought they were being. Arrogance rarely is." I opened the folder. The first page was a photograph, time-stamped 3 weeks earlier, of Vanessa and Marcus seated close together at a restaurant, 2 counties over, his hand resting over hers on the white tablecloth. their heads bent together in the particular closeness of two people with a long, private history. It was not a business dinner. I had sat through enough real business dinners in my life to know the difference. They didn't meet at Brennan Freight 11 years ago like they've always claimed, Sam said, tapping a stack of records near the back of the folder. I pulled their old university files. They met at Ohio State 22 years ago, both business majors, dated for 3 years before graduation. When neither of them had the family money to fund the kind of life they wanted, they went looking for it separately. Reyes climbed the corporate ladder. Your daughter married into yours. He paused, watching my face carefully before he continued. They never stopped seeing each other, Walter. Not once in 22 years. I've got hotel records, flight manifests, credit card statements going back further than I expected. This wasn't a fling. This was a long game. And the boy, I said quietly, though I already knew the answer. Sam nodded slowly. I got a discrete sample from Reyes 2 days ago. Ran it against what you already had. He's Tyler's biological father. No margin for error. Your daughter was pregnant with his child before she ever walked down the aisle with your son-in-law. She built herself a permanent, unbreakable claim to your family's wealth using a child that was never her husband's to begin with. I sat with that for a long moment, staring at the photograph until the edges of it blurred. It was one thing to suspect a betrayal. It was another thing entirely to hold the proof of a 22-year deception in your own 2 hands and understand that every Thanksgiving dinner, every birthday party, every proud moment you had shared with a boy you believed carried your blood had been built on top of a lie so old it predated your own wife's illness by decades. There's one more thing, Sam said, and something in his voice made me look up. He slid a single sheet of paper toward me, separate from the rest, an email printed from an account I did not recognize. This one took some digging. Deleted server. Had to pull it from a backup archive Reyes apparently forgot still existed. It's addressed to your daughter. Dated 9 years ago. I picked it up. My eyes moved across the words, and something inside my chest went very, very cold. Vanessa. The email read, "We need to be careful. If Walter ever finds out about Tyler or about the consulting accounts, he'll cut us both out completely. Preston can never know the real numbers on those transfers, and your father can never know about us. Keep playing the dutiful daughter. It's working. We're almost there 9 years. They had been planning this, in some form, for 9 years. The affair was not the only long con. The fraud, the slow bleeding of the pension fund, had roots reaching back nearly a decade, patient and deliberate, waiting for exactly the kind of vulnerability that a dying wife and a grieving husband would eventually provide. I folded the email and placed it inside my jacket, next to the paternity report, next to the printouts of shell company transfers I had gathered from the mirror server 3 nights earlier. I looked across the sticky table at Sam Delgado, who was watching me with the quiet respect of a man who has seen grief curdle into resolve many times before, in many other clients, and knew exactly what it looked like when it finally arrived. "What's your next move, Mr. Brennan?" he asked. I thought of Eleanor, of the fountain pen in my desk drawer, of the folder Vanessa had left on my counter, demanding I sign my company away with a cheap plastic pen before midnight, as though the tool itself didn't matter. As though anything about that night could ever be that simple. "I'm going to call my attorney," I said, "and then I'm going to change one name on one document, very quietly, before anyone realizes what I've done." I called Arthur Voss that same night. Arthur had been my attorney for 26 years, a man with a mind like a filing cabinet, and a voice that never once rose above a measured baritone no matter how much was at stake. I met him at his office the next morning before sunrise. The dossier from Sam Delgado spread across his desk. Alongside the printouts from my hidden mirror server, the paternity report, the 9-year-old email that had confirmed everything I never wanted to know about my own daughter. Arthur read through all of it without a single interruption, his expression unchanged. Even as he reached the shell company transfers, even as he reached the email, when he finally looked up, he asked only one question. "What do you want to do, Walter?" I told him. Not about arrests, not yet, not about federal charges, though we both knew those conversations were coming. I told him about the trust. Eleanor and I had established the Brennan Family Trust 18 years earlier, back when Vanessa was still the daughter who called every Sunday just to talk, before ambition and Marcus Reyes had reshaped her into someone I no longer fully recognized. The trust held the controlling shares of the company, the real estate, the bulk of everything Eleanor and I had spent 40 years accumulating, and under its original terms, Vanessa was named as successor trustee, the person who would inherit full authority over all of it. The moment I either died or was declared incapacitated, I asked Arthur to draft an amendment, quiet, immediate, fully within my legal right as the sole living grantor. It removed Vanessa's name as successor trustee entirely and replaced it with a name she had never once considered a threat. The newly formed Eleanor Brennan Memorial Foundation, an independent charitable trust, I asked Arthur to establish that same morning, funded from my own personal holdings, designed to provide full university scholarships to first-generation students from working families, the kind of families Eleanor and I had once been ourselves. Back when we were counting coins on a kitchen table to make payroll, one name replaced with another. Vanessa Brennan Cole, struck from a single line on a single page, and a foundation carrying her mother's name written in its place. Arthur notarized the amendment himself that afternoon, with 2 independent witnesses present, none of them anyone connected to my company or my family. By the time I drove home that evening, the document was fully executed, fully legal, and utterly invisible to the daughter who was, at that very moment, preparing the ultimatum she believed would force my hand before I had any chance to protect myself. She arrived at my house that night at 10:30, letting herself in with the key I had given her years ago, carrying a leather folio and a cheap plastic pen, exactly as she had 6 days earlier, except this time there was no pretense of concern in her voice at all. "Sign tonight, or lose everything," she said, sliding the folder across my kitchen counter, the same counter where Eleanor used to roll out pie dough every November. "I mean it, Dad. The board meets in the morning. Preston and I need this finalized before then, or I promise you, things get a lot harder for everyone." I looked at the folder without opening it. I already knew, better than she did, exactly what it contained and exactly how little power it actually held. "Things get harder for everyone," I repeated slowly. "Is that a threat, Vanessa?" "It's a fact," she snapped, and for the first time in 6 days, the mask slipped fully away. "You're an old man who just lost his wife, running a company that's too big for you to manage alone anymore. I've spent my whole life waiting for what's supposed to be mine. I'm done waiting." I picked up the folder, opened it slowly, and let my eyes move across the same emergency trusteeship language I'd already read once before. Then I closed it again and set it back down on the counter, right next to her cheap plastic pen. "No," I said. Her jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" I said no. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my own pen, the fountain pen Eleanor had given me 31 years ago, and set it deliberately on the counter between us. A small, quiet act of defiance she did not yet understand the weight of. "I already signed something tonight, Vanessa. 3 days ago, actually. You just didn't know about it." Her expression shifted from anger to confusion, and for one brief moment I almost felt something like pity looking at her, watching the first faint crack of fear appear beneath 22 years of careful performance. The doorbell rang before she could respond. I had asked Arthur and 2 men from the FBI's white-collar crimes division that Sam Delgado had connected us with to arrive at exactly this hour. Once the amendment was fully filed, and once I was certain Vanessa herself was standing in front of me, rather than warned off by some earlier confrontation with Marcus Reyes downtown. Arthur walked into my kitchen first, flanked by Special Agent Renata Kowalski and a younger agent whose name I never fully caught in the chaos that followed. Vanessa's face went the color of old paper. "What is this?" she said, her voice climbing an octave. "This is the end of a very long con," Arthur said calmly, setting his briefcase on the counter and opening it with the same unhurried precision he brought to every negotiation I had ever watched him conduct. "Marcus Reyes was taken into federal custody 40 minutes ago at his home on charges of wire fraud and embezzlement related to nearly $3.8 million diverted from the Brennan Freight Employee Pension Fund over the past 11 months. and additional charges the Bureau is still finalizing related to a broader pattern going back several years. Agent Kowalski stepped forward and placed a single document on the counter, the paternity report, already independently verified by the Bureau's own lab as part of building their case against Marcus for financial fraud connected to falsified beneficiary claims on certain shell accounts. "Mrs. Cole," Kowalski said, her voice flat and procedural, "we need to ask you some questions downtown regarding your knowledge of and involvement in these transfers." Vanessa did not scream, not at first. She stood very still, staring at the paternity report on the counter, and I watched 22 years of careful architecture collapse silently behind her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the boardroom authority she'd carried into my kitchen 20 minutes earlier. "You knew," she whispered, looking at me. "This whole time, you already knew." "I found out 4 days ago," I said. "In a hospital hallway watching your husband's face while a doctor asked for his blood type." "Preston doesn't know anything," she said quickly, too quickly, the old instinct to protect the weakest link in her plan surfacing even now. "Preston has known for 9 years," I said, and I placed the printed email on the counter beside the report, watching her read her own words back to herself for the first time in nearly a decade. "Keep playing the dutiful daughter. It's working. We're almost there." She did not deny it. She simply stared at the page, and something in her shoulders finally broke. Agent Kowalski escorted her out 20 minutes later, not in handcuffs, not yet. The questioning downtown would determine what came next. But Vanessa left my house that night as a woman whose entire future had just been rewritten in a single evening. And she knew it. Preston, when I called him afterward, did not fight, did not deny, did not perform outrage the way Vanessa had. He simply asked quietly, what would happen to Tyler? I told him the truth. Tyler was not responsible for any of it. Whatever had been built on a lie, the boy himself was innocent of every part of it, 17 years old, and about to discover that the entire foundation of his family history had been fabricated by 2 adults who should have known better. I told Preston I would cover Tyler's college tuition in full, regardless of what happened to anyone else, because a child does not deserve to inherit the consequences of his parents' choices. Preston wept on the phone, and for the first time in 14 years, I believed every sound coming out of him was genuine. The following months moved with the particular slowness of federal investigations and the particular speed of a company trying not to collapse under the weight of its own scandal. Marcus Reyes was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement, the shell companies dismantled one by one, the stolen pension funds gradually traced and, through a painstaking process that took nearly 4 months, fully recovered and restored to the accounts of the drivers and warehouse managers who had earned every dollar of it. Vanessa was named as a co-conspirator in the fraud, having knowingly facilitated the falsified consulting invoices in exchange for her own cut, though her attorney negotiated a plea that spared her the maximum sentence in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. She lost her position on the board permanently, lost her home, which had been purchased with money now proven to be stolen and was seized as part of the restitution order, and moved into a modest apartment across town, a fall from the life she had spent 22 years quietly engineering. I saw her twice in the year that followed, both times at Arthur's office, both times brief and businesslike. She never once apologized, not directly, though during the second meeting she asked, very quietly, whether I still thought about her mother. I told her I thought about Eleanor every single day, and that Eleanor would have wanted me to protect what we built, even from our own daughter. She did not respond to that. She simply left, and I have not spoken to her since. Preston, stripped of his position at the company and unable to face the community that had known his marriage as something it had never actually been, moved to a small town 2 states away, took a job managing a hardware store, and sends Tyler a card on his birthday every year with nothing more than a short, careful note inside. I do not know if he and Vanessa remain together. I have not asked. Tyler is the part of this story I still think about most. I sat him down myself 3 weeks after that night in my kitchen and told him everything because I believed he deserved the truth from someone who loved him, rather than a rumor filtered through gossip. He cried for a long time. Then he asked me, in a voice much smaller than his 17 years, whether I still wanted him around. I told him that blood had very little to do with the years I'd spent teaching him to throw a football in my backyard, or the summer we rebuilt an old truck engine together in my garage, and that nothing a lab report said about paternity could undo any of it. I told him I would cover his full tuition as promised, no matter where he chose to go, and that my door would remain open to him for as long as he wanted it to be. He is a sophomore in college now, studying mechanical engineering, and he calls me every Sunday, the same day his mother used to call before ambition rewrote her into someone else entirely. I rebuilt the company slowly, the way I'd built it the first time, with the same patient stubbornness Eleanor always said was my one genuinely useful character flaw. I brought back 3 senior managers Marcus had quietly pushed out during his final months of consolidating control, restored the pension fund in full, and personally stood in front of every driver and warehouse worker at a company-wide meeting to guarantee, in language plain enough that no lawyer could later twist it, that their retirements would never again be vulnerable to the greed of people I had once trusted with my name. On a cold morning 8 months after that night in my kitchen, I stood on the roof of the Brennan Freight headquarters with Arthur beside him and signed the final documents formalizing what the amended trust had already quietly begun. Half of my personal holdings went permanently into the Eleanor Brennan Memorial Foundation, guaranteeing scholarships for students who would never otherwise have the chance Eleanor and I had fought so hard to build for ourselves. The remaining half was converted into an employee ownership program, distributing real equity in the company to the very people who had spent decades building it beside me. Truck drivers and dispatchers and warehouse crews who had bled for this company as much as I had, and who deserved, finally, to own a piece of what their labor had created. I kept the fountain pen. I use it still, on the rare documents left that require my signature at all, though most of the company's daily operations no longer pass through my hands. Some mornings I sit in my study, in the same chair where I once discovered a decade of hidden fraud in the glow of an old monitor, and I think about how close I came to signing away everything Eleanor and I built with a cheap plastic pen, simply because someone I loved told me I had no choice. You always have a choice. Even at 64, even grieving, even standing in your own kitchen, being told the walls are closing in, you always have a choice, provided you are willing to look closely enough to see it. Family is not a claim written into a document. It is not a name on a trust or a shared surname or even, as it turns out, a shared strand of blood. It is loyalty, chosen and renewed every single day, and the moment someone forgets that, they forget what the word was ever supposed to mean. I changed one name on one piece of paper 3 days before anyone ever handed me an ultimatum. It was the quietest thing I did in this entire story, and it was the only thing that mattered.